we reached out to hiring experts, recruiters, and executives from all over the country to hear their advice on hiring and recruiting excellence. Here's what they had to say. Around the topic of hiring fast versus hiring better, what are the pros and cons? Obviously, that's a hot ticket here. With the labor market being red hot, people are doing almost anything to hire people. But is it hurting them? Let's hear what the experts had to say. What is the biggest drawback of hiring fast?
I think the number one biggest drawback of hiring too quickly is that more or less the underlying factor that's making you hire too quickly can be sort of a false premise. And so we're seeing this with large technology businesses right now that are having to go through layoffs where they hired really, really aggressively in 2021, 2020, 2022. They now have to change their workforce strategy to actually decrease the amount of people that they have because their business couldn't keep up with the hiring. And so the false premise here was that the world was awash in free capital and would be for the next foreseeable future. And that obviously it was not the case. And so I think a lot of companies, whether it's free capital or a very expanding market, have these sort of potentially false premises that lead to hiring too quickly, which then obviously can also lead to hiring the wrong people, culture issues, etc.
The flip side of that is, what is the biggest challenge with leaving a role unfilled?
Leaving a role unfilled obviously is going to hurt your business if that role has been created for a logical reason. And so if you look at a lot of HR technology, actually, the number one ROI driver is decreasing time to fill. And the reason is that if somebody's in their job and they were hired for the right reasons, they're going to be adding a lot of value to the company. So you can, as a sort of easy rule of thumb, say whatever their salary is times 2 or 3 for various roles that have very scalable impacts, like engineering, that might be more of a 10x. But if you think about it, somebody at least is making the amount of value for the business as their salary. Otherwise, that business wouldn't be in business for very long. And so let's say somebody gets paid $1,000 a day. It's a nice salary, but it's a round number. And that role is unfilled for 10 days. That's $10,000 that that person would get. But the value to the business is probably more like 20 or 30 or maybe even $100,000.
Is there a benefit to hiring slower and doing it better, even if it means leaving that role unfilled?
The upside to hiring slower is simply making sure that you're getting the right people. If you take more time, that means you have a much higher probability of having somebody stay for the long term. And as we all know, maintains institutional knowledge, it improves your culture. It probably leads to cheaper hiring sources like referrals and having a strong culture that will retain people so you don't have to hire as much. And so there's actually a lot of value in making sure that you're hiring at the right pace for your open roles.
No matter what the situation, what are 2 things we can do to make sure a bad hire doesn't slip through?
I think the number one thing is to be really transparent about who your organization is not for. If you're a big company, it's really bad for entrepreneurial people, vice versa. If you're a remote company, horrible for extroverts that need to be in the office, etc. And so it's important to make sure that you are showcasing who this organization is not for, just like you want to sell people on who it is for on the flip side of that. And I think the other thing you can do is to work on a project together. Something that if it's really long, maybe you want to scope it and pay them as a contractor, but you basically want to showcase what it's like to work with you and understand what it's like to work with them so that you can have more conviction around working together over the long term.
What is your best technique to assess candidates to make sure you're getting an A player hire each time?
My number one technique is to work on a project together to make sure that everybody knows what it's like to work with each other. I think that doing reference checks can also be really important if you're able to ask the right questions and get somebody to sort of be honest about the candidate. If somebody's not honest, that's probably actually a really bad sign because they're not willing to say anything negative and maybe they're worried about, lawsuit or they're really not that close to this person. But if you get somebody who's really transparent and says, hey, they need to work on this, this, and this, but they're really good at X, Y, Z, then you can have a lot of conviction around that. I think the other pro tip here is to be really transparent about your hiring process. If you're going to have a long and robust hiring process, then you're going to want to make sure people are on the same page and they're not surprised by how long it is.